Bye. Welcome to Speak with Eve. I'm your host, Eve Eurydice, and my guest today is a writer I admire. She's the author of 7 books, including a trilogy of books about the Armenian genocide and its aftermath. She was born in Saudi Arabia of Armenian heritage. Micheline Arachonian Marcom. Welcome to the show, Micheline.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you. So today I moved to discuss with you the future of literature, the future of academic learning, of cultural appropriation, and the resulting kind of like loss of trust in authority, right? Or at least in the authority of the knowledge keepers. So you are a professor. You've spent your career more or less in academia, more than me anyway, right? So it seems to me that academia used to hold like knowledge and knowledge makers, tight, right? In the gatekeeping that like reinforced the privatization of knowledge that's been going on since like the beginning of the patriarchy, basically, right? Where like culture made knowledge and knowledge belonged to like the elites, the priests, and then later, the bookkeepers, then the priests, and that kind of went back and forth, I think. The enforcers of power or the diviners of power, kind of like back and forth. But anyway, then even with the Gutenberg press and the widespread literacy, in the industrial model, I feel that, universities and schools like held on to knowledge, and that changed with the invention of the computer. So since the 1960s, we had like the French philosophers, telling us basically that everything is simulation and hyper-reality and deconstruction and, structuralism and false perception of the self in the mirror and all of that, right? So the death of the author. So, I'm talking about like Jacques Derrida, Lacan, Barthes, Baudrillard, and from there we find ourselves in this moment where all of that has come true, very practically. And there is a burgeoning, civil war between the populists and the elites.
I only have my own anecdotal, really, observations in the classroom for 25 years. And then there are bigger questions and maybe bigger patterns about, other things. And I don't know where you want to start. I mean, I think that I was having this thought this morning, as I'm reading a lot of Kafka, for class I'm teaching, that it's so difficult to see the time you live in with any kind of real clarity and with not, I don't know what the right word is. It's not exactly clarity, but with like, you see it, you can see it well. That's always difficult. Maybe it's more difficult now because it's a noisy, rumbling time with so much access to these media, social, so-called media, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's always difficult. And there are always noisemakers that seem like they're speaking the truth and speak with conviction and authority. And those can come from all kinds of political backgrounds, but I generally probably aren't. And time then reveals to us more of the pattern. Someone like Kafka, who probably saw through some things that he could encode in his literature in the 20th century. And not just in the ways even that he's understood, like, the term Kafkaesque, whatever that means for people in dark and bourgeois, whatever world that we live in of procedures, etc. Well, that was what I was thinking about this morning. And I, as someone who reads a lot, I'm seeking wisdom, and I don't find it very much in too much of the current discourse. Even in the last 100 years, I feel like for me, I have to look at books across time and space, and then there are these moments, little bits of like, I feel like, what Borges might call the labyrinth. You're in the labyrinth if you read a lot, and in books here and there, you will find these bits of gnosis, of human knowledge that has been kept and is there for those, who read,
who seek,
who seek. And I mean, so reading is the thing that I do. I know that there are lots of ways to come to wisdom and knowledge, and I'm not saying that reading is the only one, but it's the one that I know the best, because I've spent 25 years reading more closely than, I was always a reader as a child, but really reading in this different way. And so that's what I'm not answering your question, but that's what I've been thinking about. Because I wonder if sometimes I don't really know what's going on, but whatever's going on didn't just start. It's been going on for a while, probably for 400 or 500 years or something. We're in or maybe since the so-called Enlightenment or whatever it is. It has something to do with what we might call secular society, when society doesn't even believe anymore in anything outside itself and holds itself up as the final arbiter of all things. So the gods, the divine, the absolute is not even admitted as a possibility. I mean, it's a very strange thing, probably very dangerous.
Yeah.
Because you can't, whatever the forces are, potencies or the gods, including the Godhead, you can't just talk your way out of it. We still see it, like when violence shows up on the scene, for example. There's no reasonable answer or explanation. So reason in that sense becomes a kind of a dead end.
Well, I mean, the Enlightenment was a re-education, on a vast scale, right, of human beings. And like pre-Enlightenment, people invoked the gods or the saints or hoped for, a solution or redemption in the other world. And now, magic was like transplanted by science and computational math and, even financial instruments like crypto.
Yeah.
So
there's something around that's happening. That Simone Weil said it. And, the social is the only idol, and I think about that a lot, and what that means if you idolize the things that the social or society makes, whether it's institutions, it's laws, it's banks, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And without that other world, or that kind of intuitive or alchemical connection to nature that's represented by these otherworldly practices, death like makes us sick, like just the idea of death, because we have no way of accepting it. There is definitely a trend toward division between the people who are supposed to know and have knowledge to pass on, and those who were supposed to kind of like receive knowledge, who no longer trust the knowledge makers and givers, right?
I guess what people call cultural appropriation is nonsense. It's to me, it's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Whose culture? Who are the police? Who decides they're the police of culture? And based on what? Is that based on blood? We're talking about someone's blood. Well, how much? What's the authenticity factor here? Because we're speaking of I guess the authentic, and then the raiders or something. The colonizers is, I guess, the terms people would use now. I don't think if anyone thinks any of this through, you're at a dead end here. It doesn't make any sense. And if you go at all into understanding history, and I mean, I'm no expert, but I know that humans have been exchanging their knowledge, their stories, their technology, since we, probably walked out of East Africa. So it doesn't make sense to me. And I think what it's really about is power, and who has power and who wants power and who feels resentful. And that, as usual, the clothing of the dialogue or the discourse is saying one thing, but really is about sort of something else, which seems to be a power play. Most of the time, if we're not speaking in specifics. And I mean, as someone who loves books, and I don't love all books, but I love books and what they do, I'm always looking for like the individuals, the artists who were onto something, who were listening or working at a high level, and are able to transmit that in their work. And it doesn't matter to me if the work is doing that. That's what matters to me. I think that's such a great gift. I don't understand. I always tell my students, don't beat books up. It doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you beat up a book or whatever, Don't read it if you don't like it, I guess. But this game of politics that's in everything, I think it's misguided mostly. I really do. And I think mostly, at least in terms of literature, is because people aren't really reading. We're really distracted. And to really read is to spend a lot of time, because it's not in the first read of anything that you barely are there when you first read something wonderful. You have to read again and again, and that's where the real pleasure is. And which I think literature is doing, and myths and what stories do. They're thinking about bigger patterns. And then as humans, we're noisy. We talk a lot. We yell. We scream. We fight. We fuck. Whatever we do, all that's wonderful. But it may not be what's really going on. Just like how I often don't really know what's going on with myself. I think I'm fine, and then I'll watch a commercial and I'll start crying because who knows? We don't often. So that the drama of human life or the theater is not always what it seems. And I think even in this case, I think often there's just this resentment that is often really personal, actually, when I look at specific people who are complaining. And so we play out our personal lives, of course, in the public sphere. And with social media, that's even easier because everyone can put their opinion in the public sphere.
One, great, positive energy, that there is in the literary impulse is this, trust that there is a future and there is a reader in that future, who wants to read this chronicle, right? This testimonial. I mean, Anne Frank, hidden in that, secret annex, right in her journal or whatever. So that's, for Kafka, very much. I think that's there.
He understood, and I think we understand as writers, that the language that we use is very debased because we're using it to speak now, we're using it to sell laundry detergent, we're using it to run the banks. And so this is all this. And so to have words reverberate and resonate again in a way that they do, say, in sacred works, or, that is, or to make so that they are part of literature, that's part of it, and figuring out how to do that. And I mean, and just rereading, because I was reading the trial this morning, it's so in how he does it, I don't know, but so that words that are quite pedestrian, suddenly they start humming. Words like duty and words like guilt and just a few others I was thinking about. It's extraordinary, actually. The law, of course.
Yeah, the law.
yeah.
It's very hermeneutical, the way that, his works read.
Yeah, and I guess by religious...
Talmudic,
Yeah, so that by religious we might mean that we re-know the magic, like the Egyptians might have said, of the word, or in the Logos, the book of John, right? The beginning was the word. The extraordinary magic, whatever language is, whatever communication it's permitting. I think old cultures, and or the Vedas understood that language was something more than, at least in current, that we remember. We have forgotten, maybe. And so literary arts, I think, at least in part, are about that. I mean, even not knowing any of that when I started writing, I've always felt this affinity for language, for the word, and just intuitively gravitated to writers and in my own work to understanding that you have to get the language to sing. It has to sing again. And just all the ways in which it can, whether it's narrative, it's rhythm and musicality, it's tone, it's all these things that I often talk to my students about, but then the writer herself has to find her own way with language to make it kind of, like someone like William Faulkner, who I also really love, to make it kind of do work again, so that it opens into silence as much as into speech. In some ways, it takes you places where you get beyond language, into experiences that in other ways, maybe an ecstatic might have an experience that she or he can't put language to. And I think books have that capacity too. And it's hard to talk about because reading is such an individual, solitary thing. So to really talk about what happens when one reads, when you have an experience like that, is so difficult to put language to. But I think it's part of the reason, it's not the only reason I've always been a reader, because it's something I didn't experience till I was a little older, but that's part of the reason I read. That deep communication with the soul that is possible. And then you can also just be entertained and have the wonderful magic carpet ride of story and go into distant realms and, that's wonderful too, right? But
yeah, I mean, that's what Kafka does so well. He just, starts with something that's so wild that you just got to stay with it to figure out what, where we are and how we got here and, what is this world and what humans are those, right? And then
and the system that you're in. And what's so strange about it is that all the physical earthly details of the metropolis and the banks and this and that are there, but as you read, that's not what's really happening. That it's about something else. So there's always this multiple levels of reality somehow. When you read, that. And so that's extraordinary, and that's something that I think.
Well, that's what do. That's the hermeneutics or the biblical, or where it's like the literal, and then there is the allegorical and the anagogical and the moral, and right, there are all these layers at the same time. So it allows you to read something. It allows a text to become sacred. That text has this ability to mean more than what it just says. Otherwise, you couldn't have this experience of it.
Right. And at the same time, all the commentaries on any text never can stand in for the thing itself. Like, it's only through reading or maybe listening if it's recited out loud. And that's what's amazing too,
And last time we met on the island of Crete, we were talking about, prehistoric civilization, and we're talking about the Minoan writing that has and has not been deciphered, and the power of the goddess or the female divine matriarch or mother body in that culture, and the spiral, the kind of meditative labyrinth again, right? Going round and through this kind of like repetition, finding sense.
Most of us, myself too, but most of us just don't even know that that what we're thinking is, where do we get these thoughts from? Where do we get these ideas from? Well, it's like mimetic behavior. It's just moving around. Everybody just picks it up and thinks that they're thinking. Well, are you really thinking? No, I doubt it, So that's just always going on with human beings. Maybe the internet, that's just made it more, you just see it go fast, because now ideas flash and they come on like, here's the thing now. This is the moral truth. this is justice, social justice or whatever, you know, and then it changes and then it's something else and it's splintering and splintering and splintering. So it seems like it's changing quickly, but it's probably the same pattern of, you know, mimetic behavior or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, we all, you know, we all want to desire what others desire. Otherwise, this world would not make sense at all. Like if we could just be authentic and we weren't trained to, you know, do as others do or care what others think or all that stuff. That's our like conditioning. Yeah. But I mean, René Girard speaks of the scapegoating mechanism, right? Which,
yeah, he does.
Yeah. Which, you know, that's when our desires finally converge on like an object, and that same, you know, that creates like the moment of violence when violence erupts and you know, attacks that one victim that stands in for, let's say, all of us, right? So
and we see that all the time now. I mean, it's just whatever this canceling thing. What is that? That's the scapegoat mechanism, I suppose.
Yeah. There's a lot and it's like coming from all sides.
Oh yeah. It's such a human thing. Yeah.
And it may be that like the sacred can only express itself through through this. I mean, not express itself, but express itself clearly. You know, in a way that everybody understands. Oh, you know, that's how we're changing as a culture, is through, you know, a huge kind of sacrifice like that. I don't know, but definitely both in in Kafka's time or a little after, and you know, Faulkner, like there were huge like political and, you know, kind of like, let's say, civil war moments going on, because we could think of World War II as the civil war in Europe, right? So
yeah, I don't know. I mean, he's in that sense, yeah, of course. I mean, people say that about his work, but when you read it, when I'm reading it now again, you know, you can't help but think about how prophetic it is. But because, of course, he writes before the Second World War, but you know, I think he was sensitive. He just probably that pattern. If you play the pattern out that was moving, it was going to get to the kind of thing we saw probably in the Holocaust, and it's terrifying and horrific.
Yeah.
And and so much of like Faulkner's work, he really influenced me early on, was about the dead, you know, and the duty to the dead, and slavery in America and all the suffering of African Americans, and you feel that in his work. You feel the heft of the dead.
Oh yeah, I know, it's so thick. Yeah. But I mean, both of them, you know, have that sense of like something is brewing and something is like, you know, breeding, and like that, you know, it's gathering force and it's threatening the structure of like law.
Because he's working at such an essential level, and the language is so. It just reverberates, and the stories, you know. So anyway,
yeah,
there is,
okay.
He was clairvoyant, actually, Kafka. I didn't realize that. Yeah. He went to a lecture that Steiner gave, Rudolf Steiner.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I just was reading it this morning. I was like, this is so interesting. So Kafka goes and meets with him, which we know because he wrote about it in his diary. And he went to meet with Steiner, you know, the Theosophist, Blavatsky, and all those guys in that new spiritual movement of the 20th century, because he didn't really like that he was clairvoyant, I guess. I don't know. It's very interesting to think about, but there is. And that's something that artists don't often talk about, as we know in popular society, but that communication that happens, maybe, you know, some people would call it the muse or whatever it is, but there's always a communication with other realms or other things or other forces or beings, or, you know, call it what you will. And I think that's there in Kafka too. And his dreams. He you know, paid a lot of attention to his dreams.
Yeah, I remember that. So basically, he he went to Rudolf Steiner, or he met Rudolf Steiner for that, to kind of figure out?
Apparently, he went to a lecture Steiner was giving in Prague. Einstein, I guess, went to one too. I mean, that's the thing. Einstein and Kafka overlap. Rilke, he met Rilke. And in Kafka's diary, he wrote what he said he spoke to Steiner. We don't know what Steiner said to him, but it's pretty interesting. And he mentions this clairvoyance that he has that he doesn't really like. And he never mentions it again, actually. It was 1911. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's definitely, like, a lot of Kabbalah, aspects to the writing. And that's what we're talking about. There is like a mysticism. So perhaps it's there in all great literature. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe modern literature in the last several hundred years, there's something, that's interesting to think about too, how it's changed. I don't know. Because we live in a different time, We don't live in a time where we regularly have rituals that acknowledge the invisible realm in some ways that are the society itself. If you go to church or temple, or you do it on the side, you go on the weekend or whatever, it's not the whole society itself is not doing that.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's exactly what, I was saying before, that we've lost, we have lost that whole religious aspect. So we're stuck in this, scientism, right? Where we worship science instead of God as like the all-knowing, the giver of knowledge. And that's just, there isn't enough there to feel, the human hunger for a greater meaning. No, or the human heart or the soul. And also, of course, what's so crazy about doing that is that even in physics, to the extent that I can understand quantum mechanics and the way people are, we know that Newtonian physics isn't real. That's just one way it's a way to describe reality as we experience it through our senses, etc. But it's not real. That life isn't made up of reducible things. No, when you are in the quantum world, all of that description doesn't work anymore. So it's kind of fascinating, because then you end up swinging around to the Vedas or to the old myths, who understood levels of reality in ways that science just simply in this Newtonian model won't get to, right? It can do some things beautifully, but not others. Yeah. This is what I always have a hard time talking about, and I wish I try to understand more about, what they are understanding at the highest levels of physics, right? But that it's a mirage. It's Maya. What we see. It's not really reality. Whatever that is, whatever the real is, it's not what our eyes and ears, right, sense. Our senses have these particular ways of sensing, and they're limited. So then how do we sense what is beyond our senses? The imagination. And then it's so demeaned. It's like, how can you demean something as incredible as human imagination or intuition? Yeah, it's just, or what you might call clairvoyance or whatever, it's like these are this possibility that human intelligence has that is. For example, the second coming or the end of the world, it's a spiritual event. It's not a historical event, but, when you understand it literally, you create, chaos and violence and confusion, right? We don't have any, we're losing the understanding of what spiritual events are, which, like you said, gnosis, so like that's the Hermetic Gnosticism, right? Like the things that you see, but not with these two eyes necessarily.
Right. Right. And in fact, when I feel like I come to know something, I feel it because the hair rises on the back of my neck. And that's how I know something. It's not, I can't really think my way through it. I don't have that kind of mind.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But still, like right now, we're in a moment of, neuroscience, right? It's the fastest moving, like, branch of science, record the brain and make, and all the time it's like, brain implants. And now we found out where this happens in the brain and what that happens and the signature, this, like, and that's the only stuff that we listen to, as a culture, and we, pay attention to, close attention to. It's a time of reckoning. I feel that the hour is late, and maybe that's why I'm asking you. What's the future of literature? What's the future of will the center hold? It's all the same question.
I think the future of literature will always be those individuals in the world, living or not yet born, who will awaken to that calling, and who, even if you think you're doing it for one reason, it may be that it's that possession that writers used to speak of, or vocation. But I don't think that's changed, because you have to spend so much time alone. You have to like solitude. You have to love to read. You have to love to spend your time with sentences. That's just not going to be, that's always just going to be a small group of people.
Yeah.
And then of course there's all kinds of writing. There's, writing yarns, there's writing for film, there's writing blog posts, but I'm not speaking of that kind of writing. But still, any kind of writing, it's still one human being's consciousness up against, the page.
I learned that kind of union between culture and nature that I had not experienced at all my whole life of thinking and writing and accessing other worlds when I was pregnant, and I finally felt that I made sense to myself, and I was privy to like an unspeakable sacred knowledge, I felt like I hadn't quite existed until then, and now I just like naturally made sense. Like I was naturally outside, the system of patriarchy that seemed to be limiting, and being like 1 + 1, being like one consciousness but two beings kind of thing. It just, I just felt that this is what it's about. I felt fully sentient in ways that were, beyond my ability to communicate, but were exactly that, what we're talking about, that other language, that other sense of being. So, yeah, and I haven't felt it, of course, since, but, I feel that, the sense of like incubating that you're saying, like, oh, when your hair stands, or, when you're kind of like, gestating knowledge that's greater than just like the words that, the everyday words that we use to describe, life and, the neighbors and our whatever accounts. And yeah.
Yeah, I had that. Definitely getting pregnant, giving birth, and then nursing a child for many years. I do remember I was a much more so kind of intellectual probably before then, and very in my, so-called head, wherever that is. And then, I got pregnant, and it was like all that intellectual kind of hoo-ha didn't hold like a candle to this experience of this full, body expression, this, whatever the body this female body that I have that took however many millions of years on Earth to come into being, I guess. You think about evolution and the evolution of species here and plants and everything, then I just remember thinking when I was pregnant, I'm not thinking at all. I'm not doing anything. And there's this child happening in my body, that I'm making, but I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And, and then giving birth, which, when people talk about ecstatic experiences, potentially that human beings can have, I was never told. And I've spent some time reading about mystics and ecstatic experiences that mystics have had. And, you can look at the saints and this and that. But one of them, and the whatever the 3, 4, 5 are modes of having a mystical experience in your body is birth. Oh yeah, natural childbirth.
For sure. Yeah.
And I never thought about that, but I did have a natural childbirth. I had my son at home, and
yeah,
I know. I remember we talked about it, and I realized 20 years later, when I gave birth to him, that I had what you could call an ecstatic experience. I had a vision when he was born or becoming born. It's so funny that I didn't have any language for it. I didn't know what it was. It was there as a vision until many years later. I was reading about visions that mystics had. And somebody who was talking about psilocybin, I guess, and the visions that people have sometimes taking psilocybin, talked about the visions that mothers will have when giving birth. And I had this little click in my mind. It was like, yes, I had a vision when I gave birth to my son. I don't know if you did too, but
oh yeah,
yeah. Oh, yeah. I saw the ancestors when he was being born. I saw them there waiting. And so that kind of knowledge of the ancestors that human beings have always had, like you go back to any of the old stories, everyone's talking about the ancestors, ancestor worship, it's called. I don't think that's the right term, and it's just that to me that's so real. And I don't have any of the rituals anymore. But it wasn't born into a time where they're still here, but it's still here. It's still real. So just because you lied or ignore something doesn't mean it's not real.
Yeah.
And that's what I think a lot about. This mirage we live in now that we live in because our minds are so powerful and strong and we're so social. And now we have this internet stuff that we do. And so we're just amping up our stories to each other, and we voluntarily get these phones where we listen to these darn stories, and it's all a mirage.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of it is.
Yeah. No, I totally felt that it was like a rite of passage into womanhood. It was like the threshold, just like the new life comes into the threshold of, the beginning. I mean, the very beginning of the possibility of a separate consciousness. Like the mother comes into comes through this threshold of adulthood.
Yeah.
And without it, we're just girls. And
yeah, possible. I mean, and the sacrifice that's required. Then you have this baby, and there's so much sacrifice. You have to give over yourself for the child, to feed the child from your own body. And
it's
which
great.
You don't have to do, but we have done obviously for millennia. And so all of that, all of that is here. That's part of life on Earth.
Yeah.
And
it's great. I mean, I love it. Yeah. I love it partly because it didn't fit all the categories, no one quite, because our culture is so, the patriarchy based, right? There was no verbal account of what this is, the sense of first of all, with conception, we immediately enter the space between being and unbeing, because I remember I saw the two little lines that showed that I was pregnant, and I went for a walk, and I started thinking, I hope the walk's not hurting. I mean, it's not even it's not a fetus, it's not an embryo at that stage. Yeah, but the sense of my own unbeing had begun, where I no longer thought what I want, which up to then was all I, was conscious about, is what I was going to do next, right? And that broke into half, and it was, and then you begin to unconsciously almost, prioritize the well-being of this unknown other that's also you, because you share this one consciousness of you. So it's mind blowing, basically. It's very empowering and mystical.
Yeah, and just to think about all these women's bodies, like, so that my son through my body, me through my mother through my grandmother through my great. I mean, you just think about that and go back into whatever time is. I mean, it's just an extraordinary, and all this knowledge that is in the fluids in the body is. Our friend Ginu Kamani would say, it's it's true. It's so much wisdom in there that is available, and it may or may not come into thought, maybe because the ideas we've inherited, whether these ideas, the debasement of the feminine and of the mother, that's been going on for so long and all that, but the experience is there. It's so strange that we can think our ways into and out of things that aren't, I don't know, like the way that motherhood is kind of debased, or the great feminine, when the power of making life.
Yeah, well, I think that,
it's just unbelievable.
The culture is terrified of it. I mean, that's what it is. It's so Promethean. That the culture is, terrified. I mean, like this decision by the Supreme Court, like, to me, speaks of the terror of the people who cannot have, make life with their bodies. The terror of the people who can, that's as simple as it is, like the people who, do not have a uterus are terrified of the people who do, because they don't understand it. They can't, like, it's such a derangement of what, of our understanding of humanity, which has been put into words by the male, based on the male desires, the male gaze, the male, sense of self, that it's just, too destabilizing. So that's why it's not valued. It's the same reason that, like, we don't value nature at large, so, like, according to the law, like, if you cut, like, 10 ancient oaks, you pay a fine. If someone bothers and takes you to court and pays for lawyers and stuff, the fine would be like a few $1,000s. To me, it should be millions of dollars, because I think that's the value of natural life, and it's kind of like the same, like the value of the work of the mother, to me, should be paid, is worth, like, financially to the culture much more than the value of, like, CEOs, or Wall Street traders, like, shoving and transferring wealth around to and fro endlessly, for a cat. And yet it's not
just paying
paid
15%. Yeah, they don't pay their share.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's probably true, that this terror of all the forces of nature, which we can, no matter what thinking we do and whatever, banks we build or houses or whatever things we try to protect ourselves from the disorder and the chaos. We know this from all the old stories. And somehow the mother, the great feminine, who, when you give birth to, because you are at mercy isn't the right word, but you will enter the chaos when you go into childbirth. It is out of your control. There's no being in control. There's just moving into the pain and trusting this very old process that all mammals, go through in giving birth and live birth. And so the wanting to distance ourselves, not just men and women, from these forces on this earth of ours, and pretending that we can, which also, I think you're right, is a fear and trying to distance ourselves from nature. But of course, we are nature. We are nature. We are of earth. We are made from earth. We are on earth. We're earthlings. And I'm not sure how much human behavior has changed in all these thousands of years.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, like, the cultural project has been to, pretend to dominate, this chaos, right, and put order on it. And here we are, and we're 100% cultural workers, and we want to prove that, that's just a fallacy with a PH, that, there is no way to kind of like enforce, culture onto nature, right? In the long term, nature will prevail. So how do we adjust our culture to this reality?
I mean, I don't know. I just think somehow things have gotten in the last several hundred or maybe longer, maybe a few thousand, who knows, it's the Greeks or whatever, this abstraction. So that once you start down the road of abstracting, you abstract and you abstract and you abstract and you abstract, and suddenly you're in some kind of glass palace way, way up in your thinking air that is so far from what we might call truth.
Right.
And so that's why again, you go back to Kafka, he's like, takes these words and you go back, what is this? What does the word mean? Even words themselves that have these long histories, and then you get when language allows us to really get far removed from whatever we might call the real. But childbirth does not. Childbirth is not a language experience.
Right. Not at all.
No.
The fertile body is just like, the big issue, who owns it, what happens with it, it's like, that's the whole story of like Eve in the garden, and, her stealing of the knowledge, and then, her having to cover up basically the fertile body, that she, her fecundity, and, cover up her, her sexuality, which is again, like the fecund aspect of her. It's not the sexuality as we think of it now, when we have like birth control and, in vitro and all of that. It's very much the sexual appetite in connection with like, conceiving and, giving natural birth. And, her acceptance of all, comers, so to speak, right? And, patriarchy comes in, and says, no, you're going to belong to one man so we can regulate things and create order, which is like patrilineal order. We got to know who, the babies belong to. Well, they belong to her. But anyway, it's, I think, inevitably we're moving away from that model. And,
I don't know. It's hard to tell if we are or are not. I mean, this is all part of these stories. I mean, that story isn't that old, really. I guess it's kind of old, but it's not that old. It's it's just part of when written systems come in, and it's the rise of agriculture. And when human beings become settled, then they tell these kinds of stories. And when you're settled, then you need a lot of children to work the land. And then you need to know which children are yours. And you have settlements. And then so you have a whole different kind of human organization, I'm guessing. Then, but that story, when I grew up as someone who was raised Catholic, it was taught to me, probably like all these stories, and you learn it as if it is the truth, it is the way. And I was taught, I think pretty directly, that women were inferior. And I think that's a terrible falsehood to teach any human being. But it was taught to me, and I think I rebelled against it for a long time. So it took me a long time to really, I don't know if maybe that's what life is trying to come into greater awareness of what you sense in your quiet part of yourself, that gnosis or intuition that is in a human being able to perceive that we all have what feels really true. And then so many of those stories, like the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, it's so misconstrued by the readings. So not that there's the story itself, which you can read in the Hebrew, or you can read the translation and figure out for yourself what you think it means. But it's not that story as much as how people interpret or have interpreted it for us, so that we are living with all these people's interpretations. Yeah. And they're literal, they're dogmatic, they're ideological. They've changed a lot, obviously, in the last few thousand years, and they continue to, but that's so much of it too. Because in the Garden of Eden, there's the tree of knowledge, right, which Adam and Eve partake of. And there's the tree of life too. There's two trees in paradise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
these are things that actually Kafka was thinking about. Go back to him, and because probably Nietzsche was thinking about it, and he was reading Nietzsche, and he was reading Schopenhauer. I keep reading and I don't understand it. It's number 64 of the Zero Aphorisms. The expulsion from paradise is eternal in its principal aspect. This makes it irrevocable, and our living in this world inevitable. But the eternal nature of the process has the effect that not only could we remain forever in paradise, but that we are currently there, whether we know it or not.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah. That's like the Calvino at the end of Invisible Cities.
Yeah.
Where he says you have to find what is not inferno, and that it's always we are and we are not. We are in paradise. We are not in paradise.
Yeah. Well,
Something
the
like that.
eternal contradiction that
Paradise.
art can resolve, and
or can give you glimpses of
the balance,
as ecstasy.
Yeah.
All of the beauty of what is beauty that it reminds you.
Yeah. Beauty is what's greater than we are, right? The awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Micheline. Thank you for coming on the show and spending the hour talking to us.
My pleasure.
And we'll speak again. And everyone out there, until next week, keep speaking love and war and mystery. If I could make love incessantly, I would be God.